All right, when we're thinking about nutrients in forest ecosystems, one important question to ask is how are those nutrients distributed in the ecosystem? Again, this is one of these places where physiology really overlaps with ecology, and we need to be thinking across those boundaries. Nutrients are obviously very important for physiology, but as we're managing those nutrients, we're really managing them through the ecosystem. So understanding nutrient pools just means parts of the ecosystem that contain nitrogen, for instance. Um, it can help knowing what those pools are can help us understand how to manage those nutrients. So thinking about nutrient pools in forest, um, by far the largest nutrient pool is the soil. It contains greater than 90% of ecosystem nutrients. And that's one of the reasons that when we talk about forest management and ecosystems, we talk a lot about the integrity of the soil and making sure that our actions maintain soil health and soil integrity. And that's because that soil contains the nutrient capital that's necessary to grow a forest. So we have to protect the soil. After the soil, the next largest nutrient pool is the trees, the forests. Um, and this table is from a study that was published in the 70s where they estimated in a forest ecosystem, in this case, a 16-year-old loblolly pine plantation, where are the nutrients distributed and in what quantities. So we have different mineral elements here, NPK, calcium, magnesium. Those are all macronutrients. And it shows where those are distributed in the ecosystem. Uh, are they in the needles or branches or wood or roots? Uh, and in what quantity? So these are all expressed in kilograms per hectare. So for instance, in this forest, if you took all of the needles from all of the trees on a hectare of forest, there would be 82 kilograms of nitrogen in those leaves on that hectare of forest. They do this, the way they do this is they go into the forest and they cut down trees and weigh different components of the trees and then develop relationships between, for instance, tree diameter and height and mass of leaves or mass of stem, develop those relationships and then go through and inventory plots. So now after you have that relationship and do an inventory, you can predict what, for instance, the stem mass would be of all the trees in a plot. And then once you measure then the concentration of nutrients in those different components and you know the mass, that allows you to estimate the amount of nutrients in those different components. So there's some interesting things we can find by looking at data like this. So for instance, like I mentioned, in all needles on a hectare of forest, there are 82 kilograms of nitrogen and 10 kilograms of phosphorus. Um, Another interesting thing is, so for instance, on a hectare of forest, all of the living and dead branches and stem wood, there is this much nitrogen. So that'd be 50, 60, 139 kilograms of nitrogen in the branches and wood. Oh, and then let's add bark just for fun. So that'd be 175 kilograms of nitrogen in the branches and stem, including the bark. Who cares? Why would anyone want to know that? Well, it's interesting. It's interesting to know how the nutrients are distributed in an ecosystem, but from a practical perspective, this tells us something about what happens when, for instance, we do a clear-cut harvest. When we do a clear-cut harvest, we remove, for instance, the stem wood and stem bark. So that's 115, between those two things, that's 115 kilograms of nitrogen that we remove from the site. And, 16 kilograms of phosphorus. So that helps us to understand how that harvest impacts the nutrient capital on that site. You're removing those elements from the ecosystem. If we do a whole tree harvest where we chip everything, that would add up to that 175 kilograms because we'd also would be chipping branches and hauling that away as chips. So these types of analyses can tell us something about the effects of harvest on site nutrient capital. And these kinds of data, when you do a harvest, you don't go out with this table and use it for decisions about fertilization. But these types of data have guided scientists who formulated fertilizer prescriptions for different situations. So this type of science has been really helpful in us understanding nutrient management in managed forests. One concept that's important to distinguish when we're talking about all this stuff is concentration versus content. I want to do black here. Okay. Concentration of an element just means the percentage of the element in a tissue. So the numbers in these two graphs are percent concentrations of phosphorus and nitrogen in different parts of a tree. Percentage is often used when we're looking at individual organs. For instance, we might say that leaf has a nitrogen concentration of 1.5%. Content is different. Content is a total amount of an element in a tissue or in a pool. So that previous slide where we talked about that table in loblolly pine, those are contents. Those are expressed on a kilogram basis. So for instance, if we had a needle that had 1% nitrogen concentration, and that needle had a dry mass, or that bundle of needles had a dry mass of 100 grams, that would mean you had 1%, that's 0.01, times 100 grams of dry mass. That would mean that in that bundle of needles, you have a nitrogen content of 1 gram. Okay, so you can see how those interchange. 100 grams of needles that have a 1% nitrogen concentration have a nitrogen content of 1 gram. Okay, so you can see how those interchange. When we look at concentrations, we see some trends. So in general, the concentration of mineral elements tends to be highest in the most physiologically active tissues. So leaves are the most physiologically active tissues, and they tend to have the highest nutrient concentrations. So you can see here for both phosphorus and nitrogen, leaves have the highest concentration of those elements. Small branches have a little bit lower nitrogen concentration. Big branches have even lower concentration, and stem have even lower concentrations. That's sort of also a gradient in amount of living cells. There's lots of living cells in leaves. There's much fewer living cells in a chunk of stem. for instance. And it's those living cells that are physiologically active where most of those nutrients are. So that's a general trend. Leaves tend to have greater concentration than branches, than major branches, than stem. And bark tends to be intermediate between leaves and branches, for instance. The other thing is that we sometimes see variation in concentration among species. So this can be especially true between angiosperms and gymnosperms. So this is a generalization, and generalizations always have exceptions. But in general, angiosperms have higher nutrient concentrations and higher nutrient demand compared to gymnosperms. Now, there's always exceptions, but that's a generalization. And if you sort of think about where you often see angiosperms and gymnosperms on the landscape, if you had to generalize, you'd say in general, you see gymnosperms, conifers, in the crappie sites, on really high droughty sites or on nutrient poor sites like in the flatwoods, whereas you see angiosperms on river bottoms and moisture richer sites. So angiosperms tend to grow in more nutrient rich environments and have a higher nutrient concentration and higher nutrient demand. Gymnosperms are more adapted to poor nutrient conditions and tend to have or require lower nutrient concentrations. That sort of shows up a little bit in these data. I guess there's some exceptions, but for instance, in phosphorus, you can see that, the hickory and oak and white oak have higher phosphorus concentrations than the loblolly pine. And that sort of is also generally true in nitrogen in these organs. Okay, so there's a bit of a species variation there. Again, there are exceptions, but that's sort of a generalization that we see. I want to introduce you to this type of question that shows up on some of my quizzes and exams. This is a greater than, less than question. So the answer to these questions will either be a greater than symbol or a less than symbol. And the question is set up in columns. So I might have a column of values on the left and a column of values on the right, where, for instance, here we have on the left concentration of boron in a healthy pine needle and concentration of phosphorus in a healthy pine needle. And you need to decide whether greater than or less than is the appropriate symbol to put in that space in between them. So let's think about this. So what's the difference between boron and phosphorus? Boron's a micronutrient. Phosphorus is a macronutrient. So phosphorus, because it's a macronutrient, will be required in greater quantities than boron. So in a healthy pine needle, the concentration of boron will be less than the concentration of phosphorus because boron is a micronutrient. So this is a handy way for me to test you on questions that are easily put into a big thing, little thing, or greater than, less than type of duality. And another example might be total nutrients in the soil in an ecosystem. Total nutrients in the soil and total nutrients in trees in an ecosystem. Okay? In this case, this is a greater than, because we know the soil is the largest nutrient pool in an ecosystem, so the total nutrients in soil is a greater quantity than the total nutrients in the trees in any particular ecosystem. So just wanted to introduce you to this question type because it does turn up on some of our tests.